Welcome to this session on solidarity and resistance. One of the most important things I think we looked at in the last session on borders was the extent to which that bordering practices function as barriers to movement and interaction. So they present a kind of interface where meeting places and points of contact are created. But if we only look at bordering from one perspective, then we're not seeing the full picture and other ways to engage with bordering activities. Can this be the only outcome of this interface between migrants and the state, and migrants and the public? Might there be other outcomes and responses, or might there be other ways to engage in bordering activities? And it's important to think critically about migrant activism and protest because we need to explore not only how migration policies are constructed and experienced, but what space there is to carve out alternative terms of settlement. And this is what we'll be looking at in this session. So looking at the session aims, we'll be considering how solidarity, resistance are conceptualised and theorised, connections between theoretical underpinnings and how we bring this into conversation with migrant-led protest, and then looking at particular case studies and situating these within theoretical debates. So the first session is really about understanding what we mean by resistance. And we have here some questions that I'd like you to pause and consider. Thinking about the course so far, the connections you might make to solidarity and resistance, what it can mean in the context of migrants' lives, what it might look like, where it might happen, who's involved, and what links we can maybe draw between resistance and the everyday context. Our starting point for exploring what we understand by resistance is informed by the influential work of James C. Scott, anthropologist and political scientist. He conceptualised everyday resistance as the ways in which the vulnerable work to stay invisible to the powers that be, by really hiding and obscuring identities and activities that the state or other powerful institutions prohibit. Scott introduces the idea that oppression and resistance are in constant flux, and that by focusing, as often is the case, on visible historic events, such as organised rebellions or collective action, we can easily miss more subtle but still powerful forms of everyday resistance. Scott's work in Weapons on the Weak looks at peasant and slave societies and their ways of responding to domination. And he found that overt peasant rebellions were actually rather uncommon, did not occur when and where expected, and often didn't have much impact. But rather than seeing resistance as organisation, he looks at less visible, everyday forms of resistance, such as, in his case, foot dragging, evasion, false compliance, feigned ignorance, sabotage. And he finds these in rural and factory settings, but also amongst the middle class and the elites, but particularly among rural people who are less politically organised than urban populations. And he really sees power as lying somewhere between structure and agency, and somewhere between overt defiance and complete compliance, right? That there's something happening within these two polar opposites. And there are clear connections we can draw between resistance and ideas of hidden and invisible power, not just hidden forms of power that can be used by powerful actors, but similarly, relatively powerless groups can employ strategies of resistance which hide their actions from the powerful. And I think we can extend this by adding the voice of migrants, precarious workers, people claiming asylum, sans-papiers, refugees, to how we understand resistance. We could argue that migrants can accumulate multiple forms of resistance, often less visible, and because they're not headline grabbing, often less well documented. So there are cases whereby the state or other institutions are simply not present or powerful enough to see all aspects of social life. And I think this does give us something to think through when we explore the possibility that everyday acts can chip away in sometimes imperceptible ways at prevailing power relations and effect some kind of social change. Now we have some foundations to think about resistance in the everyday context. I'd like to turn to the work of Ambalavana Sivanandan. When writing about communities of resistance, he explores the community self-help tradition and Black unity movements in the form of community groups and associations. And this emerged from discrimination in housing, education and employment, developing grassroots support services that could be framed as a form of urban protest movement. He talks about the creation of spaces of survival, so training schemes, nurseries, youth projects, specifically targeting the Black community, serving as public spaces where people can self-define their identities, linked to a consciousness of solidarity and a politics of resistance. These spaces of survival contribute to the emergence of what he describes organic communities of resistance, coalescing not just around questions of race, but about shared concerns and social problems and experiences of discrimination and exclusion. And what he sees here is the key theme really is the emergence on the collective mobilization and the association or associational practices as central to resistance and solidarity. His more explicitly critical perspectives on association development emphasises that associations merge through choice, but also through a desire for important social change, and in this sense they have a transformative quality because they're focused on addressing discrimination, resolving conflict, and challenging inequalities, whilst also recognising, and this is important, that experiences of opposition or indeed empowerment may mask continuing marginalisation. And I should say something here, that his critique of the way in which this self-help was used to develop what he and others have termed the race relations industry, and that this in fact created a layer of Black middle-class administrators who would manage racism, stifling protest, absorbing disquiet in relation to structural inequalities. And this is the point about continuing marginalisation rather than it being truly transformative. And what we've also seen in the UK is much of the way in which migrant associationism has been theorised has followed the race relations model, which he argues, Sivanandan argues, undermines self-reliance and independence of Black and other minority grassroots initiatives. Because what happens with this model, that it becomes focused on core questions of control, allocation of and competition for resources. So looking here at this slide, some questions to reflect on when thinking about these key arguments. What we might want to think about is the continued relevance of Scott and Sivanandan, how we might trace those ideas to contemporary society. So where do they fit in terms of what we see happening around us? And in the past decade, there is a noticeable upsurge or increase, certainly in more visible migrant mobilisation. And what might this mean for how we theorise resistance? Do we need to extend our definitions? Do we need to think more broadly? And how do we use this thinking and thinking through to work through some of those problematic boundaries that reproduce the us-them categories and in many respects speak to what Sivanandan was critical of, which was about pitting communities against each other?